There are varieties of the transcendental argument, but a transcendental is something that does not depend upon space or time for its actuality. And this is the nature of transcendentals. We all deal with transcendentals. So, for example, you may have a dog. I don't know if you guys have a dog. I have 2 cats. And so, I'm a cat person. I like cats, okay? Well, if I go over to your house and you have a cat, I will say that's an instance of cat. And I have a cat too. Well, what kind of your cat? They said, what's your cat's name? And so if one of our cats were to die, the essence of catness, the transcendental nature of what catness is, does not die with it. What we're observing is a particular instance of catness. Or if you have a table in your kitchen, I have a table in my kitchen. We see the transcendental nature of what we identify as tables. And if I were to destroy my table, it doesn't mean tableness is destroyed. If I had to write number 2 on a chalkboard, and you were to write number 2 on a piece of paper where you are, and we're hundreds of miles apart, what we're seeing is an instance of the transcendental nature of what we call two-ness. If I were to erase that 2 or cross it out, two-ness is not destroyed. So what we're seeing is an instance of something. All right, now this is similar to Platonic norms, but that has its problems. These laws of logic, for example, or the transcendental nature of certain morals, or certain truth statements, whatever it might be, or the very fact that you have two-ness, four-ness, table-ness, chicken-ness, or whatever it might be, a transcendental quality or nature. And you can remember something. They're not simply the product of human minds, because human minds are finite, not transcendental. And they're not products of the physical realm either.
So they must be products of God's mind, so God must produce or cause them?
Because the laws of logic proceed out of God's infinite transcendent mind. If these laws, these transcendentals, I'm going to make a statement here, that all transcendentals are abstractions. 2 is an abstraction in the mind. 2 plus 2 is a statement. What occurs in the mind. At least in Christianity, we would say that the universal abstractions, the universal transcendentals, which are abstractions, they occur here. Two-ness occurs here. You don't take a picture and you can't hold it. It's here. And they're universal. Therefore, we'd say there's a universal mind. And of course, I will only defend the Christian God. And therefore, the Christian God can explain how these universals can occur. And where the atheist one can't. That's a good argument.
Here's a summary as I understand Matt. There are transcendentals like catness, two-ness, and 2 plus 2 equals 4. All transcendentals are abstractions that occur in a mind. They cannot occur in a finite mind, so they must occur in an infinite mind. I take it that Matt thinks that 2 is God's abstraction, that is God's thought, though he is not very clear. Craig explains why God's abstraction cannot be a universal like two-ness.
God's thought of the number 2 is about 2. But then his thought is not 2, but something distinct from 2. 2 is what he is thinking about. But he is not thinking about his thought. He is thinking about 2. Therefore, his thought cannot be 2.
Therefore, God's abstraction cannot be 2.
Are there, in addition to particular things, universals that these different particular things have in common? For example, all red things share or exemplify the universal redness, and it's identical in every red thing, at least of a particular shade. The whole motivation behind postulating universals was to have something that could exist wholly in spatially separated places, because concrete objects don't do that. They cannot exist wholly in spatially separated places. But the idea was you could have a universal like redness, which exists wholly in the fire engine and wholly in the apple and so forth. Well, for that very reason, God's thoughts as particulars don't seem to serve the role played by properties, because his thoughts are not universals, they're particulars. His thoughts are not your thoughts, and they're not Sherry's thoughts or David's thoughts. These thoughts are particular mental events in God's mind. And so they don't seem to be the sort of thing that can exist wholly at spatially separated places, or which can be exemplified by particulars. On the contrary, they are particulars. So it seems to me that on the face of it, the idea that properties are God's thoughts subverts the whole reason that properties were postulated in the first place to be universals.
Craig is saying that concrete things, that is causally efficacious things, like God's thoughts, aren't the sort of thing that can exist wholly in spatially separated places, or which can be exemplified by particulars, since it is a particular. For example, it seems odd to say God's thought, which is redness, is exemplified by all red things.
In the literature, this is known as the bootstrapping objection, after the famous Baron von Munchausen, who tried to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. The problem can be most clearly seen with respect to the creation of properties. According to absolute creationism, God has created all properties. But in order to create properties, God would already have to possess certain properties. For example, in order to create the property being powerful, God would already have to be powerful. Thus, God would already have to possess a property in order to create it, which is viciously circular.
Take the idea that universals or propositions are God's abstractions. God would have to be the creator or cause of his abstractions, for if he is not the cause of his abstractions, then there's no reason to call them his. God's abstractions belong to him in virtue of him being the cause of them. First, consider universals like being powerful. In order for God to create that universal by being an abstraction in God's mind, he'd already have to be powerful, so God would have to pull himself up by his bootstraps. Second, consider the proposition God exists. The truth that God exists would depend causally on God's abstracting that proposition, but it seems that in order for God to abstract in the first place, it already has to be true that God exists causally prior to his abstracting. You cannot rebut this criticism by pointing out that God is timeless. This is about a causal or explanatory priority, and not a temporal priority.
In understanding the bootstrapping objection, that we understand we're not talking about temporal priority, because you're quite right, there is no temporal priority of God to his properties or the existence of properties. Properties will exist eternally and necessarily. So one is talking here about a sort of explanatory or causal priority. The absolute creationist wants to say that properties exist because God created them, or because they're ontologically dependent on God. So he's explanatorily or causally prior to the existence of properties. And the bootstrapping objection arises, it seems to me, from the fact that in that causally or explanatorily prior state, God couldn't create properties unless he already had certain properties. He couldn't create the property being a concrete object unless he already were a concrete object. But then he would have the property of being a concrete object before he created it, which is viciously circular. So it's not a temporal or chronological priority, but an explanatory or causal one.
Lastly, there is a problem with the Trinity. One of the main motivations to accept universals is to account for the resemblance of things by the sharing of something in common. Suppose I think of 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you think of 2 plus 2 equals 4. The Platonist says we are thinking of the same thing because we share the same abstract proposition as the contents of our thoughts. But how can the Trinitarian explain resemblance? Consider the Father thinking of 2 plus 2 equals 4, and Jesus thinking of 2 plus 2 equals 4. They would have to share something in common, but there doesn't seem to be anything that could play that role other than something distinct from their thoughts. Particular thoughts are not the kinds of things that can play the role as the contents of other particular thoughts.